The Uninvited at Honeysuckle Cottage, A Miss Marple Mystery England, 1952, The Village of Ashenwick, Oxfordshire, Chapter 1. The jam competition that wasn't the annual Ashenwick Harvest Fair had been held on the last Saturday of September for as long as anyone in the village could remember, and the year 1952 was no exception, except, of course, that it was. The fair traditionally occupied the wide south meadow behind St. Cuthbert's Church, where the elms had begun to turn a tired gold, and the morning air carried the faint mineral smell of approaching autumn. Stalls had been erected since dawn, trestle tables covered in waxed cloth, bunting strung between wooden posts, a coconut shy operated by Reg Hooper's eldest boy, and, most importantly, the marquee of the Women's Institute, where the preserves competition drew more genuine passion than the flower arranging. The Victoria sponge, or even the needlework combined. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 10:30, slightly later than she had planned. Her hip had been troublesome in the night. The damp, she supposed, which was coming early this year, and she had spent longer than usual pulling on her grey wool stockings. She carried a wicker basket, containing 2 jars of her own damson jam, which she did not expect to win in anything, but which she felt it courteous to enter. The ribbon for finest preserve had eluded her for 6 consecutive years, and she bore this fact with the equanimity of someone who had long understood that life's smaller injustices were rarely personal. The meadow was already lively. Children shrieked near the coconut shy. Mrs. Partridge, who ran the post office, was deep in conversation with Mrs. Bellamy from the hardware shop, both of them casting sidelong looks at the marquee entrance, where a small crowd had gathered. Miss Marple noticed the crowd at once. Not so much the size of it as the quality. The particular stillness at its centre that suggested something more serious than a dispute over chutney. She made her way across the damp grass, nodding to the vicar's wife as she passed, and paused at the edge of the group. Dr. Fenwick was there, which was the first notable thing. The village doctor had no reason to attend the preserves competition. His wife, who might have dragged him along, was in Cheltenham visiting her sister. The second notable thing was that Dr. Fenwick was not looking at any jam. He was looking downward, with the careful, composed expression of a man attempting to show less alarm than he felt. On the ground, partially obscured by the fallen edge of a trestle table, lay a woman. She was perhaps 55, stoutly built, in a good wool coat of deep green. Her hat, a formal affair with a Petersham ribbon, had come slightly askew. Her face was turned to one side, cheek against the damp grass, and one gloved hand was outstretched. As though she had been reaching for something when she fell. Is she? Miss Marple began quietly, to no one in particular. Dead, said Dr. Fenwick, not looking up. I'm afraid so. Yes. A murmur went through the small crowd. Someone toward the back said, "Oh, Lord," and someone else immediately said, "Shush." Do you know who she is? Miss Marple asked. The doctor straightened, removing his glasses and cleaning them. A habit, she had noticed, that men adopted when they needed a moment to think. Mrs. Pauline Voss, he said. She's been staying at Honeysuckle Cottage these past 3 weeks. A tenant. She came down from London. Miss Marple looked at the woman's face again, peaceful, in the way that sudden death sometimes was. No sign of a struggle, no visible injury. A woman who had simply fallen, except that people did not simply fall at harvest fairs without some cause. And Dr. Fenwick, who was a careful man, had used the word dead with the particular weight of someone who had not yet decided how much more to say. What killed her? Miss Marple asked, quite simply. The doctor put his glasses back on. I don't know yet, he said. That's the honest answer. She was perfectly well yesterday. I saw her myself. She came to collect a prescription. A prescription for what, if I may? He glanced at her, mildly surprised. Miss Marple had that effect on people. They were always mildly surprised when she asked a direct question, as though they had assumed her too decorative to require information. Iron tablets, he said. She'd been anemic, nothing more alarming than that. By 11 o'clock, Constable Briggs had cordoned off the marquee with stakes and twine. By 11:30, a car had been summoned from Oxford. A detective sergeant named Hopper, youngish, with a brisk manner and a notebook already full of what appeared to be assumptions. The harvest fair carried on around the margins of this, which struck Miss Marple as both typically English and quietly revealing. People did not leave, but they lowered their voices and ate their toffee apples with a slight air of guilt. Miss Marple found a folding chair near the entrance to the church hall, where she could sit unobtrusively and observe the field. She had not yet entered her damson jam, but that could wait. What could not wait, in her private mind at least, was the question of Pauline Voss. She had been a stranger to Ashenwick. She had been staying at Honeysuckle Cottage, which was owned by a Mr. Frederick Innes, a retired solicitor. She had come from London. She had been in apparent good health, and she had died. Here, publicly, at the harvest fair, which suggested either that death had been pursuing her some time and caught up with her here, or that it had been arranged to look accidental in the best possible venue for confusion. The constable walked past with his notebook. Miss Marple raised her hand. "Constable Briggs, I wonder. Did anyone see Mrs. Voss before she was found? I mean, did anyone speak to her this morning?" Briggs, who was 24, and found Miss Marple slightly unnerving in the way that all genuinely observant people were unnerving, paused. "We're looking into that, Miss Marple." "Of course you are," she said pleasantly. "I only ask because I noticed something on the ground near the fallen table. I believe it was a teacup, still in its saucer, which suggests she had been drinking something before she fell. I thought that might be useful to mention." She watched him process this, write it down, and move on. The cup, she had noticed, had been placed rather than fallen. There was no splash pattern on the grass near it, which meant either someone had set it aside carefully, or Mrs. Voss had done so herself in the last deliberate moment before whatever had overcome her had done so completely. In the refreshments tent, tea was still being served. Miss Marple joined the queue. Chapter 2. Rooms let and rumours kept Honeysuckle Cottage sat at the far end of Church Lane, past the Lich Gate and the ancient yew, in the kind of position that estate agents describe as secluded, and villagers describe as apart. It was a genuine cottage in the old sense. Low ceilings, thick walls, a garden that required constant management and received it erratically. The climbing roses on the front had been magnificent once, and were still handsome in a dishevelled way, though the honeysuckle for which it was named had long since retreated to a single determined vine along the eastern wall. Frederick Innes had owned the cottage for 11 years, having bought it upon his retirement from a London firm, where he had spent 30 years managing the legal affairs of people considerably richer than himself. He was 67, tall, with white hair kept rather long, and a habit of wearing a yellow waistcoat that everyone in the village found slightly inexplicable. He was not a warm man, but he was a correct one, and the village had made its peace with him. He let the cottage during summer and autumn to supplementary income, or so it was generally understood. He himself lived in a larger house on the other side of the village green. Miss Marple learned this from Mrs. Partridge at the post office the following morning, where she had gone under the pretext of posting a letter to her nephew in London. "Such a shock, Mrs. Partridge said, leaning both forearms on the counter in the manner of someone settling in for a proper conversation. "And a woman none of us really knew. She'd only been here since the 3rd of the month. Did she come into the village often? Oh, once or twice. Bought milk from the dairy. Came in here once for stamps. Very polite, I thought. Quiet. The sort of person who doesn't give much away." Mrs. Partridge lowered her voice. "Though I did think it odd that she paid for everything in cash." "That is unusual," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Most people of that social class, a good coat, a decent hat, used a chequebook for anything over £1. Mr. Ince arranged it all by letter, apparently. He told Constable Briggs that he'd never actually met her in person. She'd written to inquire about the cottage, sent a banker's draft for the deposit, and simply arrived on the appointed day. Mrs. Partridge raised her eyebrows. "Seems irregular, doesn't it?" "It does seem a careful way of going about things," Miss Marple said, as though she wanted to be somewhere, without too many people knowing she'd gone there. She posted her letter and walked home via the long route which took her past Church Lane. She did not stop at Honeysuckle Cottage. That would have been too obvious. But she slowed sufficiently to observe that the garden gate was freshly unlatched, the curtains in the front room drawn but not completely, and that there were 2 milk bottles on the step, which the milkman had clearly not been informed to discontinue. Someone had forgotten to notify the milkman, which meant either Mrs. Voss had expected to return, or whoever might have had cause to know she would not return had not thought to handle so domestic a detail. The first was more probable. The second, if true, was informative. The detective sergeant from Oxford, Hopper, had apparently spent the previous afternoon interviewing the handful of people who had been nearest the marquee when Mrs. Voss was found. He had concluded, with some confidence, that the death was most probably a result of cardiac failure. She was, after all, 55, and she had been anemic, and the morning had been cold. Dr. Fenwick had signed nothing yet, and awaited the results of a post-mortem. This intelligence came to Miss Marple via the vicar, Reverend Albrook, who stopped her on the path to the churchyard, where she occasionally spent a quiet hour reading among the older stones. "Terrible business," the vicar said, pulling his coat around him against the wind. "Hopper seems to think it's a natural death. Open and shut," he said. "Open and shut," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That phrase always gives me a slight unease. It suggests one hasn't checked what's on the other side of the door." The vicar blinked. Quite so." He paused. "Miss Marple, do you know something you haven't said?" "Not at all," she said pleasantly. "Only that a woman who travels under some secrecy, takes a cottage in a village where she knows no one, pays cash, and then dies at a public event, after consuming something from a cup that was set very carefully aside. Well, it makes one think. About what? About the particular kind of person who plans things carefully," she said. "Whether they are the sort who plans their own death carefully, or the sort who plans someone else's." She left the vicar staring after her, and continued along the path. That afternoon she had a visitor. She had not expected one, but the knock at her door came at 3 o'clock, the hour at which social calls were least convenient and therefore most urgent. And when she opened it, she found a young woman she did not recognize. She was perhaps 28, with dark hair cut short in a modern style, and an expression that suggested she had been rehearsing what she was about to say for some time, and was still not satisfied with it. "Miss Marple, my name is Ruth Carey. I understand you're the person in the village who—" She stopped, reconsidered. "Someone said you might be able to help." "Do come in," said Miss Marple. Chapter 3. What Ruth Carey carried. Ruth Carey sat in the chair nearest the fire, which Miss Marple had lit despite the calendar's insistence that it was still September, and held her teacup in both hands with the particular grip of someone using warmth as a substitute for composure. She had been, she said, Pauline Voss's secretary, not a personal secretary. She worked for a firm in Bloomsbury, Carey and Hutchins, certified accountants, and Mrs. Voss had been one of the firm's clients for the past 2 years. But in the last 6 months, Ruth said carefully, the relationship had become less professional. She had carried documents. She had collected parcels. She had kept appointments that were not in the office diary. "I want to understand," Miss Marple said, "whether you came here because you're grieving or because you're frightened." Ruth looked at her steadily. "Both," she said, "but more frightened." "Of what, exactly? Of whoever Pauline was hiding from." She set the teacup down. "She didn't come here for a holiday, Miss Marple. She came here because she needed to disappear for a while. She said to me, the week before she left, she said, "I'll be in Oxfordshire, but don't tell a soul, not even Mr. Hutchins." She was very specific about that. "And did you tell anyone?" A pause, just long enough to notice. "I told one person," Ruth said. "My cousin. I didn't think it mattered. I just said she'd gone to the Oxfordshire countryside. I didn't give the village name." "Your cousin's name?" "Martin Carey. He does various things. He works for himself, I believe. Commissions, connections, that sort of thing." She said this with the slight stiffness of someone who had never quite believed the explanation they were repeating. Miss Marple noted the name and the stiffness both, and moved on. "What was Mrs. Voss frightened of? Did she tell you?" "Not directly, but she was being blackmailed." Ruth said it flatly, as though she had been deciding for several hours whether to use that word, and had finally committed to it. "I think she was. She made 2 large withdrawals from her personal account in August. I know, because I process client statements, and her accounts are on file. £800 the first time, 500 the second. Miss Marple set down her own teacup. That is a considerable sum." "Yes. And then she stopped. She told me she'd refused to pay any more. And 2 weeks later, she left London and came here." "Did she say anything about who was blackmailing her? What they knew?" "Nothing direct. But once. She'd had a glass of something at the end of the day, and was a little less careful than usual. She mentioned a name. Oliver Croft." Ruth watched Miss Marple's face. "Do you know him?" "I don't, should I? I don't know." "But he's been in this village," Ruth said. "I checked the local pub's guest book. I rang them this morning before I came here. A man named O'Croft signed in on the 14th of September. That's 11 days after Mrs. Voss arrived at the cottage." Miss Marple looked at the fire for a moment. A coal shifted and settled. "You are," she said thoughtfully, "a very thorough young woman." "I'm frightened," Ruth said again. "If someone killed her, and I do think someone killed her, then they know she told someone about Oliver Croft, and the only person she might have told is me." "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said gently. "If she told you his name once, she may have told others more. People who are frightened often say more than they intend to, and to more people than they remember." She paused. "Tell me about Mrs. Voss herself. What was she like? Not as a client, as a person." Ruth considered. "Private, capable. She'd had a difficult life, I think, though she never spoke of it. She was a widow. Her husband died in 1944, during the war, though he wasn't in the military. An accident. She had no children that I knew of." She hesitated. "She had a quality about her. You felt she was managing something, always. Some old trouble that she'd learned to carry without letting it show too much." "The kind of person who has a secret," Miss Marple said. "Yes, exactly that." After Ruth Carey had gone, Marple sat for a long time with her knitting untouched in her lap. Outside, the elm in the garden moved in a slow, tired way, dropping occasional leaves onto the lawn. She thought about a woman who had changed her name, for she had noticed, without commenting on it, that Ruth had twice nearly said something other than Voss before correcting herself, and who had moved through the world with the careful efficiency of someone who knew their past might one day catch up with them. And she thought about Oliver Croft, who had signed a guest book at the village pub 11 days after Mrs. Voss' arrival, and who may or may not still be in Ashenwick. She picked up her knitting and counted the stitches to calm her mind. There were 17. She was certain there should be 19. Chapter 4. The man with the ostentatious hat. The King's Head public house occupied the corner of the High Street and Wren Lane, and it was, by Ashenwick standards, a substantial establishment. It had 7 letting rooms above the bar, a dining room that served reasonable food, and a landlord named Cyril Dawes, who combined genuine hospitality with a formidable memory for detail, both of which were properties Miss Marple found useful in the present circumstances. She visited the following morning, at the quiet hour between breakfast service and the opening of the bar, when Cyril was usually to be found polishing things unnecessarily in the public room. She found him, as anticipated, polishing a perfectly clean brass lamp. She asked, in the most roundabout fashion she could manage, about a Mr. O'Croft. Cyril set the lamp down. Oliver Croft. Yes, I remember him well enough. Signed in on the 14th, left on the 17th. 3 nights. Paid cash, which isn't unusual, but he had a lot of it. Notes all over his wallet, didn't bother to sort them, and he wore a hat. People do wear hats. Not like this one, a broad-brimmed felt hat, very conspicuous. The sort of hat that makes a statement. Cyril picked up the lamp again. I remember thinking that a man who wants to go somewhere quietly shouldn't wear a hat that makes people look at him. Was he alone? As far as I could tell, he took his meals in the dining room, usually. Once I saw him in the bar, but he had a lemonade, which surprised me. He didn't look like a lemonade man, and he was watching the door. Did he speak to anyone in the village? Cyril thought about this carefully. He asked me where the pretty cottage was at the end of Church Lane, said he'd been admiring it on a walk. I told him it was privately let and not available to view. He didn't push it. He paused. But he also asked me about Mr. Innes. Miss Marple's hands tightened slightly on her basket. Frederick Innes? What about him? Whether he was a local man, how long he'd been in the village, that sort of thing. He phrased it casually. Just conversation. But he was listening very carefully to the answers. What did you tell him, the truth? That Mr. Innes had been here 11 years. That he'd come from London. That he was a retired solicitor. That he was well regarded, if quiet. Cyril shrugged. There's nothing secret about any of that. There was not, Miss Marple agreed. And yet Oliver Croft had wanted to know it. She thanked Cyril and walked from the King's Head in a thoughtful state, pausing at the chemist's to buy some liniment for her hip and conducting, while she waited, a brief internal review of what she had established. Pauline Voss had come to Ashenwick to hide. Oliver Croft, whom she had named in connection with blackmail, had followed her here. She had been found dead at the harvest fair. The detective sergeant believed it was natural causes. The post-mortem results had not yet come back from Oxford, and Frederick Innes, the man who owned the cottage where she'd hidden, had apparently been of specific interest to someone who had come looking. She collected her liniment and continued walking. The relationship between Innes and his tenant deserved examination. He had told Constable Briggs he had never met her, had arranged everything by correspondence. That was unusual. Most landlords, at least, spoke to a prospective tenant by telephone, if not in person. A banker's draft covered the financial risk, but it told you nothing about whether someone would be reliable, quiet, respectful of the furniture. Unless the correspondence itself was the point, unless Frederick Innes had accepted a paper arrangement precisely because it gave him distance. The kind of distance that, in retrospect, could be described as ignorance. She rounded the corner into the high street and nearly collided with Frederick Innes himself, who was coming out of the newsagent's with a copy of the Times and a brown paper bag of what proved, from the smell, to be lemon drops. Miss Marple, he said, with the slightly formal surprise of a man who is never entirely comfortable with unexpected social encounters. Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Innes. I'm so sorry about your tenant. What a distressing thing. He was, she watched carefully, braced for condolences. He accepted them with a practised nod. Yes, terrible. I feel quite responsible, though I don't know what I could have done. You'd never met her, I understand. Only by letter. She seemed perfectly sensible, paid promptly. I had no cause for concern. He paused. The police have been around naturally. I told them everything I could, which wasn't much. Of course. Did you keep her letters? He blinked. The correspondence? I suppose I may have. I tend to keep things. Why? Oh, no particular reason, she said pleasantly. Only that in these situations one sometimes finds that small details in letters, a phrase, an address, a passing reference, turn out to be unexpectedly useful, but I'm sure the police will have thought of that. She left him standing outside the newsagent's with his lemon drops, and she walked home with the sensation, familiar and rather satisfying, of having planted a small seed in a specific piece of ground. Chapter 5. The letter in the grate. She had not expected to be taken so literally, or quite so quickly. That evening, shortly after 6, Mr. Innes appeared at her door with a shoebox. "I found the correspondence," he said, with the slightly aggressive air of a man who has talked himself into doing something he is not sure about. 3 letters from Mrs. Voss and 4 from myself. I thought I'd bring them, rather than hand them to Sergeant Hopper, who struck me as someone who reads quickly and understands slowly. This was a more perceptive judgment than Miss Marple had expected of Frederick Innes, and she revised her assessment of him slightly upward. "Please do come in." He sat, declined tea, and opened the shoebox. The letters were there as described, in 2 separate rubber bands, his and hers. He handed her the 3 from Mrs. Voss. She read them carefully, once, and then again. The first was dated the 22nd of August, and was written in a measured, educated hand. Not the cramped script of someone who wrote often, but the deliberate penmanship of someone who had learned it as a formal skill. She inquired about the cottage, described herself as a woman of quiet habits, mentioned that she was recently widowed, though her husband had in fact died 8 years ago, which was a small discrepancy, and said she wished somewhere to rest and read for several weeks. The second letter, written 6 days later, confirmed the terms and asked one specific question: whether the cottage had a rear entrance to the garden independent of the front gate. Miss Marple paused here. "An unusual question for someone seeking rest and reading," she said. Innes shifted in his chair. "I thought so too, at the time. I told myself she probably just wanted privacy for gardening. She'd mentioned she was fond of gardening." "And did she garden?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I don't know. I never saw her." The third letter, written the following week, contained nothing remarkable, only the travel arrangements and a request that the heating be on when she arrived. But it was postmarked from an address in Pimlico, and that address had been partially obscured by what appeared to be an ink smudge of the deliberate rather than the accidental variety. "She didn't want the return address visible," Miss Marple said, "so I noticed. Eventually." She turned the envelope over. The smudge was good work, thorough, but not quite thorough enough. Beneath it, held to the light, was the partial ghost of a street name. She could make out Ard Street, SW1. "May I borrow this envelope for a day or 2? He nodded, looking rather pale. After he left, she sat with the envelope and her reading glass and her thoughts. Whoever Pauline Voss had been, she had taken considerable care with her identity, obscuring her address, paying in cash, arranging the tenancy by post to avoid a face she might be recognized by. All of this was the behavior not of a woman running in panic, but of someone making calculated preparations. A woman who was frightened but still in possession of herself, that made the manner of her death more interesting. Because a person who plans carefully does not simply die of coincidence at a public fair. The fire had burned low. Miss Marple poked it back to life and noticed in the process something she had not seen when Mr. Innes was sitting across from her, in the hearth, among the ash from yesterday's fire, a small curl of paper that had not burned completely. It had fallen between the grate bars and been sheltered from the full heat. She retrieved it with the poker carefully, and found she was holding the corner of an envelope. Not one from the shoebox, but one she did not recognize at all. It must have come with the shoebox, caught between the letters, and drifted out when Innes opened the lid. On the surviving corner, in an ink different from the letters, bolder, more hurried, were 4 words. "He knows about Whitmore," that was all. No signature, no context. The rest of the envelope was gone. Miss Marple sat for a long time with this fragment in her hand, listening to the fire. Whitmore. A name, she thought, or a place. More likely a name. A person who connected Pauline Voss to something significant enough to be blackmailed over and careful enough to hide. She placed the paper fragment in a clean envelope of her own and put it in her desk drawer. Then she made a fresh pot of tea and sat down to think properly. Chapter 6. Doctor. Fenwick's Careful Silence. The post-mortem report came back from Oxford on Wednesday morning, and the result was, officially, inconclusive. This piece of information reached Miss Marple via a telephone conversation with the vicar's wife, who had it from the constable's wife, who had it from the constable himself, which was 3 removes, but still reasonably reliable, inconclusive, not natural causes, which was what our Sergeant Hopper had expected, but not a clear cause either. The examining pathologist had noted some anomalies in the stomach contents that required further analysis. Nothing definitive. A note about the possibility of certain plant-derived alkaloids, which could indicate poisoning, but could equally indicate any number of other things. Miss Marple telephoned Dr. Fenwick directly. He was careful on the telephone. Careful in the way that a man is careful when he knows something he has not yet decided to say. But he agreed to call in at her cottage that afternoon, in passing, and did so at 4 o'clock, when the light was going and the village was quiet. He accepted tea, which he held without drinking, and sat in the chair Innes had occupied 2 evenings before. "The pathologist report," Miss Marple said. "You've seen it." "I have." "And?" He set the teacup down. "She was poisoned," he said quietly. "Or, at least, that is the most probable conclusion pending further tests. There's a compound in the stomach lining consistent with a concentrated extract of certain plants, specifically water hemlock. Cicuta virosa. It's native to England, grows in damp meadows and along stream banks. It's been used historically in folk remedies, incorrectly, with fatal results." "Odorless in concentrated form," Miss Marple said. He looked at her sharply. "Yes. How did you?" "I spent some time in a household 40 years ago where the cook was extremely interested in herbal medicine. One learns things." She paused. "And it would dissolve in liquid. In tea, for instance. A concentrated extract, yes. It would alter the taste slightly, but not dramatically enough that someone drinking quickly or not paying careful attention would necessarily notice." He rubbed his face. "She had tea that morning. There was a cup nearby when she was found." "I know. I noticed the cup." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Dr. Fenwick, why hasn't this been communicated to Sergeant Hopper more directly?" A long pause. "It will be. The final report will be explicit. But He stopped. Started again. "I know something about Pauline Voss that I did not tell the police. Not relevant to how she died, I think. But I'm not sure. I'm sitting with it." "Would it help to sit with it aloud?" Another pause. He decided, with the abruptness of a man who has been deciding for days, that it would. "She came to my surgery twice," he said. "The first time, as I told you, for iron tablets. The second time, 3 days before she died. She came with no appointment, late in the afternoon, when my other patients were gone. She said she needed to speak to someone outside London, someone who didn't know her. She was, not hysterical, not quite frightened, more like a person who has made a decision, and wants someone to hear it in case anything goes wrong." "What did she tell you?" "That she had spent the last 6 months being blackmailed, that the man behind it was someone she had known 20 years ago. Someone who knew a thing about her past that could, she said, destroy a person she cared for very much. Not herself, someone else." He met Miss Marple's eyes. She refused to say who. But she said she had decided to stop paying, and to go to the authorities. She had an appointment in London the following week, with a solicitor. "And she wanted you to know this. She said, if anything happens to me before I can get to London, it isn't an accident." Those were her exact words. "It isn't an accident." And then she thanked me and left, and 2 days later she was dead. The fire had almost gone out. Miss Marple rose with some difficulty and added a log. She did not speak until the flame had caught. "Did she mention the name Oliver Croft?" Fenwick looked up sharply. "No. She mentioned no names at all. How do you know that name? From another source, Miss Marple said, carefully. Dr. Fenwick, you must tell the police everything she said. Today, if possible. What I can tell you privately is that you are not the only person who knows this woman was in danger, but you may be the only person who has her exact words. And exact words have a way of mattering enormously in these situations. He left 20 minutes later, somewhat lighter in bearing, with a clear intention of telephoning Sergeant Hopper before dinner. Miss Marple sat alone and considered what she had not yet told him. That the person Mrs. Voss had wished to protect, the one whose destruction she feared, might well be connected to the word Whitmore on a half-burned fragment of paper, and that Frederick Innes, who had arranged a correspondence tenancy with remarkable incuriosity, had worked for 30 years as a solicitor managing the affairs of wealthy people. Solicitors, in her experience, knew a great many things, and a man with something to hide often arranged his ignorance very carefully in advance. Chapter 7. A garden that talked Thursday brought rain, which kept most of the village indoors, and gave Miss Marple an entirely legitimate reason to call on her neighbour, Mrs. Odell, under the pretext of borrowing a pattern for a particular kind of crochet edging that Mrs. Odell had been promising to lend her since June. Mrs. Odell was 71 and had lived in Ashenwick for her entire life, which made her an archive of almost geological completeness. She knew things about families that the families themselves had forgotten. She remembered connections between people that had been formed 40 years ago and never publicly acknowledged. She was not malicious, but she was accurate, which was the more useful quality. She brought out the pattern, made tea, and complained about the rain. And Miss Marple let the conversation wander for 20 minutes before guiding it gently toward Frederick Innes. A strange man, Mrs. Odell said, filling her own cup. Came here in, let me think, 41. No, 42. Just after the war started properly. He was 35 or so. Too old for the military, he said. And he had some kind of position in government work. Administration, I think. He was in London mostly. Came here at weekends. He was a solicitor, I understood. Later, yes. He built up his practice in London through the 40s. Very good at it, apparently. Had some rather important clients. He never said who, of course, but you could tell by the sort of people who occasionally came to the village to see him. One man in particular came 3 or 4 times over several years, always stayed at the King's Head. A foreign gentleman, I thought, though he spoke English without any accent I could identify. Smart, quiet. Mr. Innes was always nervous before those visits. When was this? Oh, late 40s, 48, 49 thereabouts. She paused thoughtfully. He retired in, goodness, 51, just last year. Said he wanted peace and quiet. His nerves, I thought. He looked tired. And has he seemed settled since then? Mrs. Odell considered this at some length, stirring her tea slowly. Mostly. But I'll tell you something I noticed this summer, since you ask. In August he had 2 visitors I'd never seen before. Not the same day, a week or so apart. The first was a woman. Middle-aged, well-dressed, arrived by taxi. They spoke in the garden. I could see them from my upstairs window. I wasn't listening, you understand. Just happened to be up there. And she seemed to be doing most of the talking, and he was listening with his arms crossed. The second visitor was a man, younger. He came by car, a black Ford, and he was inside the house for less than an hour. Miss Marple's knitting needles were very still in her hands. Do you recall the date of the second visitor? It was a Tuesday, the last Tuesday in August. She looked at Miss Marple over her teacup. Is this connected to the woman who died, the tenant? I'm really not sure, Miss Marple said, which was not quite a lie. I'm simply trying to understand the general picture. You know how one's mind works. One gathers information, and occasionally something fits. You're very modest about your mind, Miss Marple, Mrs. Odell said with the slight asperity of a woman who is tired of false modesty in others. Miss Marple smiled. I'm simply very old, and I've seen a great many people do a great many things. It becomes easier with time to recognize a pattern when it repeats. That evening, sitting at her desk with her notebook, she kept a small one, in a cipher of her own devising that resembled shopping lists to any casual observer. She wrote down what she now believed she could establish. Mrs. Pauline Voss had been blackmailed. The blackmail concerned a secret about someone she wished to protect. The blackmailer was, probably, Oliver Croft. She had come to Ashenwick to, not hide exactly, but to arrange things, to prepare for going to the authorities. Frederick Innes, her landlord, had received 2 visitors in August, one a woman, one a man, before Mrs. Voss's arrival. Innes had worked as a solicitor and had a foreign client who made him nervous in the late 40s. The fragment of paper said, "He knows about Whitmore." Oliver Croft had come to the village and asked about Innes specifically. She circled the name Whitmore in her notebook. Then she wrote beneath it, not a what, a who. Someone Innes knows. Someone Mrs. Voss was protecting. Someone whose secret is the thing that started all of this. She put down her pen and looked out into the dark garden. The rain had stopped. A single moth moved against the window glass. Chapter 8. The recklessness of asking directly Friday morning brought Sergeant Hopper to Miss Marple's door, which surprised her somewhat, though she kept the surprise off her face. He was, she saw, more unsettled than his brisk manner suggested. He had clearly heard Dr. Fenwick's account, and it had disrupted what had been a tidy theory. "I understand," he said, sitting with his notebook, "that you've been making inquiries." "I've been having conversations," she corrected gently. "In a village, people talk. I listen. It's rather unavoidable at my age. One becomes a kind of comfortable fixture, like a church pew. People say things in one's vicinity." He was not quite sure how to respond to this. "The pathology report has been upgraded," he said, which she already knew. "We're now treating this as a suspicious death, possibly homicide, water hemlock poisoning, administered in liquid form, probably the tea she was seen drinking before she was found." "Who was seen serving the tea?" Miss Marple asked. He looked at his notebook. The refreshments were laid out on a self-service basis near the marquee entrance. Anyone could have added something to a specific cup. He paused. "Which is part of the problem. Anyone at the fair had access." "Except," Miss Marple said, "it wasn't quite as random as that. Someone would need to know which cup was Mrs. Voss's. In a self-service arrangement, you'd need to either serve her yourself and ensure she took the right cup, or follow her and... But no, the cup was set aside, not dropped. She set it aside herself, which means she drank from it. So someone who knew which cup was hers at the moment she was drinking, or someone she trusted enough to accept tea from directly." Hopper wrote this down, which gratified her. "We've been looking into an Oliver Croft," he said. "Had a stay at the King's Head in September. We've traced him to a London address. He's known to the Metropolitan Police in a peripheral way. Minor fraud. One charge of intimidation. Dropped. He's not at the London address now." "He may still be in the area," Miss Marple said. "We're checking." "There is also," she said carefully, "the matter of Frederick Innes. I don't wish to cast unfair suspicion. He strikes me as a man more frightened than guilty, but his connection to Mrs. Voss through the tenancy, and the visitors he received in August, and his rather extreme incuriosity about who she actually was, it all seems to me worth examining." Hopper closed his notebook and opened it again, a gesture she recognised as a man deciding to write something he'd been reluctant to write. "The letters," he said. "Mr. Innes brought them to us this morning. He said you'd advised him to." "I said the police would think of it," she said. "I'm glad he didn't leave it to chance. The envelopes are interesting, and there's a fragment of paper that had apparently fallen into the grate." He looked at her steadily. "You've seen it." "I have," she said. "He knows about Whitmore. Does the name Whitmore mean anything to you, Sergeant?" A pause. Something crossed his face. Not recognition exactly, but the near relative of it. "I'll look into it," he said. "Please do," she said. I have a feeling it may be the centre of the whole thing." He left, and she returned to her knitting with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has passed information through the proper channels without being seen to push. What she had not told him, because it was not yet an established fact, only a very strong intuition, was that she thought she knew what Whitmore meant. She had spent Thursday evening with her small collection of legal reference books, and she had found, in a 1947 edition of a London directory, a firm listed as Whitmore and Associates, Solicitors, Mayfair, a firm that had closed in 1950 under circumstances that the directory did not elaborate upon. Frederick Innes had worked in Mayfair. Chapter 9. 2 conversations in the rain Saturday. The rain returned in earnest, sheeting across the village green in great grey curtains, turning the lanes to rivers and confining most of Ashenwick to their sitting rooms. Miss Marple went out anyway, in her waterproof and stout boots, because the weather gave her an excuse to walk without purpose and think without interruption. She was crossing the green when she saw, through the rain, a figure outside the post office that she recognised as Ruth Carey. Ruth saw her at the same moment, and moved toward her with the urgency of someone who has been waiting, though not necessarily in that specific place. "I need to tell you something," Ruth said, water running off her coat. "I found out who Whitmore was." Miss Marple steered them both under the post office awning. "Go on." "A solicitor named Alfred Whitmore. He ran a firm in Mayfair in the 40s, Whitmore and Associates. He disappeared in 1950. There was a small article in the Times. I found it in the newspaper archive at the British Library last week, before I came here." She was speaking quickly, slightly breathless. "He was last seen in September of 1950. There was a police investigation. Inconclusive. His office was found in disarray. His personal accounts had been cleared out. About £4,000, and he was never traced." "A man who disappeared with £4,000, Miss Marple said. That could mean many things. It could. Except." Ruth pulled her coat collar up. "The article mentioned that Whitmore had been suspected of facilitating some kind of document fraud, wartime records, identity papers, specifically. People who needed to become other people. Some of it was legitimate resistance work, some of it wasn't. The investigation went cold when he disappeared." Miss Marple stood very still. "And Frederick Innes worked at Whitmore and Associates." Ruth stared at her. "How did you know that?" "From a directory. What I didn't know until now was the nature of the firm." She paused, watching the rain. "Document fraud, identity papers, a woman who paid in cash and obscured her return address, and used a name that didn't quite feel natural when you came close to saying it." She thought of Ruth's slight hesitation, the near correction, twice. Mrs. Voss was not Mrs. Voss, was she? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "I found a different name in an old file," she said quietly. "Before she was our client, before 1950, I found correspondence in a sealed folder she'd asked us to keep but never retrieve. I wasn't meant to open it. I did, after she died, because I was frightened." She swallowed. Her real name was Helen Marsh. She'd been Alfred Whitmore's bookkeeper. The rain drummed on the awning. "She witnessed something," Miss Marple said. "It was not quite a question." "I think so. And she used the same channels that Whitmore had used. Got herself new papers, a new name, moved to London as a widow. And she was careful for years. And then someone found her." Ruth's voice was steadier than her face. "Oliver Croft. He'd been connected to Whitmore's firm too, I think, as a client. One of the people who'd bought papers. So he knew what she knew. And he threatened to expose her, expose Pauline Voss as Helen Marsh, unless she paid. And she paid. And then she stopped, and she came here." Ruth looked at her. "But why here? Why Ashenwick, if she was trying to get away from Croft? Why come to a village where the one person who knew her real history was also living?" Miss Marple said quietly. Ruth stopped. "Frederick Innes," Miss Marple said. "He knew what she was. He'd been part of it too, I suspect. Perhaps peripherally, perhaps less so. She didn't come to Ashenwick to hide from him. She came to find him, to make him help her, to use whatever he knew to go to the authorities together, each protecting the other by the information they shared. But then someone killed her before she could. Yes, said Miss Marple, before she could. Chapter 10. The thing about water hemlock. Water hemlock, Miss Marple knew, did not grow naturally in the dry chalk meadows around Ashenwick. The land was wrong, too well drained, too far from standing water. The nearest place where Cicuta virosa could be found in any quantity was the water meadows south of the mill, about 2 miles east of the village. She mentioned this to Constable Briggs when he came to inform her. Politely, with the slight awkwardness of official communication being delivered to an unofficial person, that Sergeant Hopper had made some progress on the case, and that she needn't concern herself further. "I'm sure the sergeant is making excellent progress," she said. "I only wondered whether anyone had checked the water meadows south of the mill for signs of gathering. Water hemlock is quite distinctive in appearance, and if someone had harvested enough of it to make a concentrated extract, they'd need to do so within the last couple of weeks. It loses potency if dried too long." Briggs looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Herbal medicine," she said. "I mentioned the cook." He wrote it down. She did not expect this to lead quickly anywhere. The meadows were a reasonable 2-mile walk from the village, and anyone serious about the project would have taken a car. But it established a fact. The hemlock had to come from somewhere local, which meant someone had either brought it from outside, possible, but requiring knowledge and preparation well in advance of the fair, or sourced it locally, which meant they'd been planning this since arriving in Ashenwick, or had spent several days preparing. Oliver Croft had been at the King's Head from the 14th to the 17th of September. That was 3 weeks before the harvest fair, plenty of time to locate the hemlock, to prepare an extract, and to wait. But he had left on the 17th. Had he come back? She telephoned Cyril at the King's Head. Did Oliver Croft, or anyone matching his description, return to the area after the 17th? She asked. Cyril was silent for a moment. "Not to us," he said. "But there was a man, different name, T. Graves, who stayed here from the 24th to the 27th. He didn't have the hat, but he had the same hands." "I beg your pardon?" "Wide hands. Squarish. Very white, as though he didn't spend much time outdoors. Both men had them. I happened to notice because the second man had a cut on his right thumb. A green stain around it, actually, like he'd been handling plants." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Cyphril," she said. "Would you be willing to repeat that observation to Sergeant Hopper?" "I already have," Cyril said, with the mild satisfaction of a man who has been ahead of the game. "Rang him this morning. He seemed interested." She thanked him and rang off, and sat for a moment with the specific sensation she always had when a pattern became complete. Not triumph exactly, but something more like recognition. The kind of feeling one had when a misremembered word finally surfaced, or a familiar face resolved into a name. Oliver Croft had been in Ashenwick twice, under 2 names, with and without the conspicuous hat. He had sourced the poison locally. He had attended, or sent someone to attend, the harvest fair, which left one question she had not yet answered. Who, specifically, had handed Pauline Voss the cup? Chapter 11. The woman from the gardening committee. Miss Marple had not previously paid much attention to Vera Stanton, who ran the village gardening committee with a thoroughness that occasionally tipped into the evangelical. She was in her early 40s, brisk and purposeful, with a good knowledge of plants, and a manner that did not invite questions about her private life. She was, however, the person who had been in charge of the refreshments at the Harvest Fair marquee. This Miss Marple had known since the first day. She had not pursued it, because knowing who organised refreshments was not the same as knowing who had tampered with 1 cup out of 50. And she had needed to understand the larger picture before examining the smaller detail. Now she understood the larger picture. She found Vera Stanton at the church hall on Saturday afternoon, sorting through the leftover bunting from the fair with 2 other women from the committee. Miss Marple came in on the pretext of returning a pair of scissors she had borrowed for the needlework display, and stayed, inevitably, to help fold bunting. "Such a dreadful end to the fair," she said at the appropriate moment. Vera Stanton nodded, not breaking the rhythm of her folding. "Terrible. Yes. Did you happen to speak to the poor woman that morning, Mrs. Voss?" "No," Vera said. "I didn't know who she was until after." This was, Miss Marple noted, technically possible, but something in the way she said it, not the words but the cadence, the slight over-precision, had the quality of a prepared answer. Not a lie, perhaps, but a careful truth. She watched Vera's hands as they worked. They were good hands, capable, used to outdoor work, and the right thumbnail had, very faintly, the ghost of a green stain that soap and several days had not entirely removed. "You know," Miss Marple said conversationally, continuing to fold her section of bunting, "I've been thinking about the refreshments. Such a well-organised arrangement. The self-service table, the urns, everything so clearly laid out. I imagine you'd prepared quite a lot of things in advance." "Always do," Vera said. "Some cups set aside for specific committee members or guests of honour. That sort of thing." A pause, just one, before Vera said, "The vicar's wife had her own cup, yes, and a couple of the judges. It was just easier." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "And Mrs. Voss. Had she been assigned a specific arrangement?" A longer pause this time. Vera set down the bunting. The other 2 women had drifted to the far end of the hall, occupied with their own task. "Why do you ask?" Vera said quietly. "Because I think you knew her," Miss Marple said, in the same mild conversational tone she had used throughout. "Not as a villager, not as a tenant, from before, and I think you were asked to do something at the fair that you may not have fully understood. Or perhaps you did understand, and you're carrying that now, and it's very heavy." Vera Stanton was still. The hall was quiet. Somewhere outside, a child was calling to another child, the sound coming thin through the old walls. "He said it was medicine," Vera said at last, very quietly. "He said she was ill, and she needed it in her tea, and she'd forgotten to take it. And he couldn't approach her directly because they'd had a falling out. He said, if I put it in her tea on the morning of the fair." He set aside a cup for her, marked with a small piece of ribbon on the handle. She always took the first available cup. "If I just added the drops, it would help her. That was all. And you believed him." "He's my brother," Vera said. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything except the fact. "Half-brother, technically. We don't share a name. Oliver has his father's name. I have my mother's." Miss Marple folded the last piece of bunting very carefully and set it on the table. "Oliver Croft," she said. "Yes." Vera put her hand over her mouth briefly, then lowered it. "When the police came and said she'd been poisoned, I knew. I knew then what I'd done. But I didn't know what it was. I swear to you I didn't know what was in the drops." "What did you do with the bottle?" "He took it. He came for it the next day. Said he'd borrowed it from somewhere and needed to return it." Her face was colourless. "What will happen to me?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that you should tell the police everything you have just told me. Everything, including that your brother came the next day and retrieved the bottle. That is important." She paused. "You were deceived, Mrs. Stanton. You were used by someone who understood that a half-sister would not ask too many questions if the story was plausible, and the relationship made it seem safe to trust." "He knew I'd do it," Vera said, "because I always have. Whatever he needed, I always have." Miss Marple laid her hand briefly on Vera Stanton's. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the door of the hall and out into the thin autumn light, and she did not feel triumphant. Chapter 12. Frederick Innes confesses to half of it. By Sunday morning, the police had spoken again to Frederick Innes, this time with Dr. Fenwick's account and Ruth Carey's information in hand. Sergeant Hopper appeared at Miss Marple's door at 9 o'clock. interrupting her breakfast, which she noted but did not mention, to ask whether she was aware that Innes was now saying he had, in fact, known Pauline Voss. "I suspected as much," she said. "Please come in." He sat at her kitchen table, which she preferred to the sitting room for serious conversations. It was more honest somehow, the plain wood and the morning light. Innes worked at Whitmore and Associates for 2 years, 47 to 49. Hopper said, consulting his notebook. He claims his role was purely administrative. He managed contracts, he said, and didn't know the full nature of some of the firm's work. When Whitmore disappeared in 50, Innes says he was terrified. He knew enough to be implicated, not enough to understand the full picture. He chose ignorance as a strategy, Miss Marple said. He probably made himself genuinely ignorant of specifics, so that if questioned he could answer honestly. He says he left the firm, set up independently, moved here. He swears he hadn't heard from anyone connected to Whitmore until August this year, when Helen Marsh, Pauline Voss, wrote to him. "The woman visiting his garden," Miss Marple said. "That was her." Hopper looked at her. "You knew?" Mrs. Odell described a well-dressed, middle-aged woman who came by taxi in August. "It fits." She poured more tea. What did she want from him? She wanted his testimony. She'd made contact with a solicitor. A different one, in Oxford, and she intended to make a full disclosure about the Whitmore firm, including what she knew about the identity papers that had been produced for certain clients during the war. She wanted Innes to corroborate her account, not to expose himself, but to provide context. She believed that Innes was essentially a bystander, and that with his confirmation, her statement would be credible enough to be taken seriously. And Innes refused. Hopper made a slight face. He said he'd think about it. She gave him 3 weeks. She then rented the cottage. He says he agreed to the tenancy, partly because he thought it would give him a chance to speak to her further, to decide. And Oliver Croft found out she was here, because, Miss Marple said, Croft had sources in London. We're still working on exactly how, but we think the solicitor Mrs. Voss had contacted in Oxford may have had connections that Croft could exploit. He came here in September to verify she was here, and then he came back, as T. Graves, to arrange matters. Through his sister, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes, though we believe he didn't tell her what she was really administering. He paused. We've found Croft. He's been located in Reading, at an address he rented last month. The Metropolitan Police are bringing him in now. Miss Marple let out a slow breath. Good, she said. Good. Innes will be required to give a full statement. He's cooperating, frightened but cooperating. His involvement in the original scheme seems genuinely peripheral, though his silence over 2 years about what he knew is its own problem. It is, Miss Marple agreed, but he is, I think, more a coward than a criminal. He allowed his fear to make him passive when action was required. That is a different matter from guilt, though not an entirely comfortable one. Hopper looked at her carefully. You've been conducting quite a thorough investigation, he said. I have been talking to people, she said pleasantly. In a village, one does. He left shortly afterward, and she finished her breakfast. The egg had gone cold, but it was still perfectly good, and sat for a while with her knitting. Chapter 13. The sound of a closing door. By Tuesday of the following week, Oliver Croft had been formally charged. The charge was murder in the first degree, which Miss Marple found satisfying in its clarity. Vera Stanton had given a full statement, and was, according to Constable Briggs, cooperating entirely. The Crown prosecution was, apparently, prepared to treat her involvement as a case of significant deception rather than willing participation. Though Miss Marple suspected the legal reality would be rather more complicated, Frederick Innes had given his testimony, which had required 3 separate sessions and a considerable amount of legal assistance. He looked, when Miss Marple passed him Church Lane on Tuesday afternoon, like a man who had set down something very heavy, and was not yet sure whether the freedom of the unburdened hands was worth what had come with it. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said, "Mr. Innes." He seemed to be working up to something. She waited. "She told me," he said finally, "when she came to see me in August. Helen, I mean. I can't quite make myself say Pauline. It was never her name. She told me that she'd been careful all these years, but that being careful is a kind of prison too. She said she was tired of managing it. She wanted to stop." He looked at his own hands. "I told her she was brave. I meant it as a compliment. I think she meant it as an invitation." "And you were not ready to be brave yourself," Miss Marple said. "No," he said. "Not then." He paused. "I will give the full testimony they need. I will say everything I know about Whitmore's firm. And what was done there, I should have done it years ago." "You should," she agreed, without cruelty. "But you are doing it now. That matters, even if it would have mattered more earlier." He walked away down Church Lane, and she watched him go, a tall, slightly stooped man in a yellow waistcoat, walking toward whatever the rest of his life was going to be. Ruth Carey telephoned that evening from London to say that she was well, that the firm was handling things sensibly, and that she thought she would take a few days away somewhere quiet. She did not say where. Miss Marple thought that was probably wise. She finished the telephone call and sat for a while in her sitting room, listening to the particular silence of a village that had absorbed a shock, and was beginning cautiously to return to itself. In a week, the harvest fair would be discussed less. In a month, Mrs. Voss, Helen Marsh, would be remembered only vaguely as the unfortunate woman who had died at the fair that September, before everyone understood what had really happened. Memory in small places, Miss Marple had observed, was both more tenacious and more selective than elsewhere. People remembered the things they had room for, and they made room for the things that confirmed what they already believed about the world. A woman poisoned by her blackmailer would eventually become, in the comfortable retelling of village history, either a cautionary tale or a romance, or possibly both. She was, however, more than that. She was a woman who had lived 20 years under a name that was not her own, in a life that was not entirely her own, and had finally decided, when the weight of it became unbearable, to stop. She had been killed for that decision. But the decision itself had been the right one, and it had set in motion the sequence of events that had found her killer. There was something in that, Miss Marple thought, that deserved acknowledgement. She found her knitting and counted the stitches. 19. Correct, this time. Chapter 14. What the elm trees know October came to Ashenwick in its usual fashion, suddenly, and with a great deal of wind, stripping the elms and the beeches and depositing their leaves in the lanes in a way that was picturesque to visitors and tiresome to anyone who had to walk them regularly. Miss Marple walked them regularly. She was coming back from the post office on a bright, cold afternoon, 2 weeks after Oliver Croft's arrest, when she passed Honeysuckle Cottage and saw that someone had cleared the garden gate and put the milk delivery on hold. 2 things that should have been done a month ago, and had been sitting in their own small way as reminders of unfinished business. She paused at the gate. The climbing rose had one last flower on it, a pale yellow thing, quite unexpected at this time of year, and slightly battered by the recent rain, but persisting. Roses did that sometimes, she had observed. Produced one more bloom after everyone had stopped expecting them. She thought about Helen Marsh, who had been a bookkeeper before she was a ghost, and who had kept careful accounts of everything, money, information, risk, for most of her adult life. She thought about the courage it had taken, after 20 years, to decide to be Helen Marsh again, even briefly, even at the end, and she thought about what it must have meant to walk into a solicitor's office in Oxford and say, essentially, "Here is what I know, here is what I did, here is what was done to me. Let us see what can be made of it." That appointment had never happened, but the information had come out anyway, through a different route, and in the end the outcome was perhaps not so different from what she had intended. The law did not often work in straight lines, in Miss Marple's experience. It worked in oblique ones, arriving at reasonable destinations by unreasonable paths. She had long since made her peace with that. She walked home. The wind took a handful of leaves off the elm in her garden and arranged them without particular art across the front path. Dr. Fenwick called in that evening for no particular reason. They had developed, over the past 2 weeks, a habit of occasional conversation that suited them both. He had brought a small package from the chemist for her hip without being asked, which she found touching. "They've set a date for the preliminary hearing," he said, accepting tea. "January, apparently. Good, it will take as long as it takes. Vera Stanton is staying with her daughter in Swindon, I understand. She's not coming back to the village, I don't think." Miss Marple considered this. It's the right decision for her. She needs to be somewhere where she can be other than what she was here, what people knew of her here. She paused. She was a decent woman used by an indecent person. That is not uncommon. It is, however, devastating in specific ways that take a long time to recover from. "Do you think she will? Recover?" "I think she might," Miss Marple said. "She struck me as someone with a great deal of unused resourcefulness. People who have spent their lives anticipating other people's needs often discover, when those people are finally removed, that they have a considerable amount of energy to redirect." Fenwick smiled at this, which was the response she had intended. Then he became thoughtful. "What about Innes?" "He'll be all right eventually," she said. "He will give his testimony and face whatever follows from it and live with the rest. He is at bottom a man of conscience. His sin was postponing the demands of that conscience for far too long. He will spend some years being uncomfortable, and then he will probably become one of those men who does a great deal of quiet good in a local way and finds peace in the small scale." "You're quite optimistic about people," Fenwick said, slightly surprised. "I'm quite realistic about people," she corrected gently, "which includes understanding that very few of them are entirely one thing or the other, and that circumstances shape what parts of themselves they express. Oliver Croft made a series of choices that expressed the worst of what he was. Frederick Innes made a series of choices that expressed his fear. Vera Stanton made one terrible choice in a moment of misplaced loyalty. Helen Marsh," she paused, "made the best choice available to her 20 years ago and the best choice available to her this summer, and she deserved a different outcome." The fire settled. Somewhere in the dark garden, a bird called once and was silent. "What made you notice the teacup?" Fenwick asked. "That first morning." "The saucer," she said. "When a cup is placed deliberately, with care, the cup is centred in the saucer. When a cup is dropped or falls, it's off-centre or separate from the saucer entirely, or both. This cup was placed, which meant she had set it down herself, carefully, in the last moment she was capable of doing so, which meant she had already drunk enough of whatever was in it to be affected, and she had sat down, and she had put her cup down properly. Because some habits are so ingrained that even as the body is failing, the mind is still managing the small courtesies." She looked at her own cup. "That told me 2 things. That she had been poisoned, not stricken by a natural attack, and that she had been a very particular kind of person. The kind who, even at the end, made sure the cup was in the saucer." Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said finally, "that is one of the saddest and most admirable things I've ever heard." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I thought so too." Chapter 15. The last thread. There remained one thing Miss Marple had not entirely resolved, and it sat with her through the October fortnight like a small stone in a comfortable shoe, not disabling, but persistently there. The second visitor to Innes's house in August. The man in the black Ford who had spent less than an hour inside. Innes, in his testimony, had mentioned a visitor in August, but had described him vaguely. Someone connected to the old situation, who wanted to warn me that things were being stirred up. He had not given a name. The police had accepted this as the nervous circumspection of a man still adjusting to candour, and had not pressed hard on this particular point. But Miss Marple pressed on it, privately, for several days, in the way one picks at a knot, not from restlessness, but from the conviction that the knot matters. On a Thursday afternoon, she had a second unexpected visitor. He was a man of about 60, well dressed in a quiet way, with the composed face of someone who had spent decades being professionally undistressed. He introduced himself as Gerald Ashby. She noticed the name briefly, then set it aside as the likely pseudonym it almost certainly was, and said he worked for a government department he did not name. He sat in the good chair, the one Innes had used, and he said, "We understand you have been of considerable assistance in clarifying the death of Helen Marsh. We are grateful." "I am glad she has been given her real name back," Miss Marple said. He acknowledged this with a small nod. The Whitmore matter was complex. It has implications that go somewhat beyond a village murder, as you may be aware. Some of the identity documents produced by Whitmore's firm were used by individuals who subsequently came to the attention of other departments. We have been watching certain threads for some years. And one of those threads, Miss Marple said, brought someone to Frederick Iss's house in August. He looked at her without expression, which was itself an expression. We wanted to know whether Helen Marsh had made contact with him. She had. She wrote to him in early August, using a name he would recognise. We were satisfied that Innes was not actively involved. We considered warning him more directly, but chose not to interfere with private arrangements. "In other words," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "you knew she was here, you knew she was in danger, and you did not warn her." Another silence. "We underestimated the speed of events," he said. "You underestimated Oliver Croft," she said. "That is a different thing." "Yes," he said, after a moment. "Yes, it is." She offered him tea, which he declined. He thanked her again with the particular courtesy of the officially remorseful, and left. She watched his black car, not in fact a Ford, pull smoothly away from her lane. She sat for a while, in a state not quite of anger, but of the complex feeling that sits just adjacent to it. The awareness that systems designed to manage difficult things often managed them in ways that left the most vulnerable people outside the calculation. It was not surprising. It was not even strictly wrong. Those systems were built for a different scale, a different unit of counting. But it was worth acknowledging, even privately, that a woman's life might have been saved by a different choice, and no one in the relevant position had made it. This, too, was human nature, the kind that Miss Marple had observed throughout her life in every institution, every arrangement, every body of people organised for collective purpose. The tendency to act on the information that confirmed existing decisions rather than the information that required new ones. She was tired of it, but she was not surprised by it, and tomorrow she would knit and visit Mrs. Odell for the crochet pattern she had still not retrieved, and call in at the post office, and live her small, observant life in this small, revelatory village, where people were exactly what they always were: complicated, frightened, capable of terrible things, and equally capable of improbable grace. Chapter 16. September. Again some day, 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Ruth Carey, written from somewhere with a different postmark, Dorset, it appeared, saying that she had taken a position at a different firm, that the sealed file had been passed to the proper authorities, and that she felt, on balance, better than she had expected. She also said that she had placed a small notice in the deaths column of the Times, under Helen Marsh's actual name, with no detail other than the date and the phrase "beloved by those who knew her." Truly, it was, she said, the only obituary that felt honest. Miss Marple read this twice, then folded the letter and put it in her desk alongside the small envelope containing the fragment of paper that said "He knows about Whitmore." She would dispose of both eventually. But not yet. She picked up her knitting. The village outside her window was conducting itself in the ordinary ways. Mrs. Partridge was visible at the post office counter. The vicar's wife was crossing the green with her shopping basket. 2 children were doing something noisy and harmless on the far side of the churchyard wall. A starling landed on the gatepost, looked at her through the window with one bright suspicious eye, and flew off. The elm had lost all its leaves now. The garden was going to need a great deal of attention before spring, and her hip would not permit her to do it herself, which meant she would need to ask young Toby from the farm, which meant a negotiation she had been postponing since August. She added this to her mental list of things to do this week. She counted her stitches, 19. She began the next row, and thought no more about Oliver Croft, or Frederick Innes, or the Whitmore firm, or the careful way a woman had set her cup in its saucer, at the last possible moment of her life. She thought about spring, about whether the climbing rose on the front wall might benefit from a more thorough pruning than it had received this year, about whether Toby would be willing to take on the hedges as well, if she offered him an additional shilling. Small things, ordinary things, the best armour she had found, against all the ways the world could go wrong.